very special show for you today, Researchers on a Mission, ROAM Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J. Co-hosting with me straight from the UK is Johnny Webb, as well as Laura Lee Solomon co-hosting and co-producing in Texas. Now, the reason why I say so special is because today we have someone who doesn't just talk the talk, but actually walks the walk. Someone who has a message for everybody out there. So really tune in and pay attention, because this could make a big difference in your life. This person has served in the Canadian Parliament, as well as was the Minister of Transportation, and his highest rank as a politician was the Defense Minister of Canada, which literally put him on the map as the highest ranking politician of the G8 countries to ever speak publicly on such the topics that we're going to speak today. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend, the Honorable Paul Hellyer. Mr. Hellyer, it is a pleasure to have you back.
Hi, John. It's a delight to be back with you.
I got to say, for everybody out there, his new book, Mr. Hellyer's new book, The Money Mafia, is an excellent book because it really covers everything. And I have to hand it to you, Mr. Hellyer, in your golden years, to put together a book that literally is so comprehensive, where you have one chapter talking about the banking fraud, where you have another chapter talking about the oil cartels and the technologies that we could have been used. The other chapter speaking on Philip Corso and our starry visitors. Everything is in there, as well as a plan to fix our society. And if only the politicians out there from all the international countries paid attention and started implementing some of these changes, we would avoid basically repeat of history, maybe prevent more people from dying from starvation or hunger. Let's backtrack a second, because you've served so many years for your country, and now you continue to serve so many in your golden years, when most people would be sitting in a rocking chair. You are spreading the news and giving people the ideas and the tools of how to improve their nations. What got you started on this path? What made you have you so concerned for everybody?
Well, there have been different stages, but the thing that originally got me started was that I was a child of the Depression. And I saw poverty at its rawest form, so I decided to, after I got out of the armed forces, to go to university and study a little bit of economics. And there, the economics professors couldn't tell me why we had recessions and depressions. And I didn't think we needed to, and I still don't think so. So when they couldn't answer my questions, I figured out the problem for myself, and then they said, well, there's going to be another depression in 1950. And it was capital D, another depression like the Great Depression. So I said, I've got to just try and get elected, because this is necessary. And I graduated from university in May and was elected in June. And little did I know, of course, that backbenchers, when they're first elected, don't have much say about anything, let alone monetary policy. But, and here's an important thing, what happened was the Korean War came along. Not sure if it was deliberately induced or not, based on recent evidence, but at least it came along, and then the powers that be did what they always can do in wartime. They start printing more money, and so the Depression never happened. In the meantime, I was in Parliament and made good progress, and 8 years later, I was appointed to the cabinet of Mr. Right Honorable Louis Saint Laurent, defeated in the election in 57, got back in a by-election, partial election, you call them down there, in 58, and spent some time in opposition, and then when Mr. Pearson formed his government in 63, he named me Minister of National Defense, which was one of the four senior portfolios in the government at the time. And it was a great experience for me, and gave me the foundation that I needed for the kind of thing that has happened since. Because what we're talking about tonight is just, a whole different world than the world that we perceive to be in the 1960s. There were a lot of things happening there that we didn't know about, but the secrecy was such that really understanding what was going on in the world was a very rare thing, and there were only a few people in the loop. And it was only in recent decades that a lot of people started asking questions and saying what's really going on. And I was persuaded to be one of them. So about 10 years ago, I started taking an interest in the subject of the extraterrestrial presence and technology. And as you say, became the first person of cabinet rank in the G8 to say definitely that UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead. And that, of course, sort of unleashed a torrent of information. And I started getting, I was just what I would call kindergarten at the time, but I knew there were issues involved that had to be discussed in public, and they're still not being discussed. And so I knew I had to go public on this subject, and I was briefed by some of the best ufologists in the United States and Canada and other places, and the information poured in, documents from all over the world, some classified and some not, and dozens of books, and I've read nearly all of them. So over the years, my interest has grown and my knowledge has grown exponentially, and all of a sudden I find that we're in not just a different world as far as the cosmos is concerned, but that we're in a different world as to what's going on behind our backs by the people who have access to this information and who have been back engineering it since the 1940s. So there's so much that's gone on, and you mentioned my new book, The Money Mafia. The subtitle, I think, is important, World in Crisis, which is what I believe is the actual case. And when I wrote Light at the End of the Tunnel 4 years ago, I thought that was my last book, and it had everything I wanted to say in it. But then so much information came into my office in the intervening 2 or 3 years that I said, I must absolutely put this down on paper and make it available for people to look at and read, and not just look at and read, but then to act on, to stop this where we are now, which is really hell-bent for another third world war. And that's where we're headed, and we've just got to get off that track. And in order to do it, we're going to have to do a lot of things, and I list a whole bunch of them in the book. And now the question is, how do we get enough people interested enough in their own future, and in the future of their families, and in the future of their country, and in the future of the world, to act, get off their Chesterfields, as I call it, and do something before it's too late. So that's where I'm at now, and a brief summary of where I've come from over the years.
Mr. Hellyer, I have a few comments I want to make, but we've already received our first question via chat that I got to ask you. Basically, I'll read it word for word. What was the seminal moment when you decided to risk your very reputation with your disclosure?
Oh, the moment was actually after reading the day after Roswell, and being convinced by what I read, and then later having it confirmed by a retired United States Air Force general, that it was basically true, that there were issues that I personally had to bring to public attention because no one else was doing it. And it was a question of responsibility. If you know something, and you know that the people of the world, and especially the United States, but of the whole world, should know about it and talk about it and say, what does this mean to us? Then I finally decided that it was a go. And as I've told you before, the only two things happened. One, just serendipitously, I had been invited to speak to this convocation at the University of Toronto in September in 2005, and had no intention of going whatsoever because I'm not a ufologist. I wasn't then, I'm not now. And just hadn't got around, frankly, procrastinated in saying no. But after reading the book and having the information in it confirmed by someone that I trusted implicitly, the only remaining thing was I was getting married a week from that day. My late wife, with whom I lived 59 years, had died the year before, and so the woman whose late husband had been my best friend for 25 years, and who, with her husband and my wife, we had been a foursome, and worked together and prayed together and traveled together and took holidays together for 25 years. I asked her to marry me, and so this was planned for October the 1st, 2005, and so I phoned her and told her, and she wasn't really enthusiastic about me getting involved in this sort of thing, but I told her it was just a once-off. I really didn't want to mislead her. I had no, desire to mislead her because I'm not someone who tells lies. But as it turned out, with all of the things that have happened since, it's become not the most important thing in my life, but a preoccupation, which I feel is even more important now than it was when I decided to go public.
There are a lot of people that agree with you there that it is, if not the most important, one of the most important topics, especially one that is hidden from mankind. And this is one thing I love about you. You are truly the most credible, unimpeachable person, and humble and moral person at that. And the fact that you have your political career behind you puts you in a position to where you are going to gain this knowledge. For instance, when we spoke to Edgar Mitchell recently, who sends his regards, by the way, he says you're an incredible man, as I think so too. He lived in Roswell and was present during the Roswell event in '47, but because he was merely in high school, he didn't know anything that happened. When he returned from the moon and he went back to visit his hometown, only then did people start telling him what they saw, the military friends that had stayed in the Army, and that's when the secrets began to pour into his head from the other soldiers because of the fact that he had reached that stature. And I'm presuming that's similar in your situation, that if you weren't such a high-ranking politician, you wouldn't be able to have confirmed through these generals, such as the U.S. Air Force general that you mentioned. Now, going to the subtitle of your book, A World in Crisis, clearly this is not just the fact that we're being hidden the truth that we've been visited, but there are several other things that they're using us and letting people die that don't have to die from hunger, from diseases, from wasting energy, fossil fuels. Let's go through some of these other topics that really put our world in a crisis at this moment. That's more so than in the past.
Okay. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with the money, the banking.
Well, the money thing is an old problem. And I don't know how deeply we want to go into it tonight, but it is the most urgent problem in the world. It's not the most important. I think global warming is the most important, but the money problem is the most urgent because it's the reason that there are billions of unemployed people, the reason that people are starving, the reason people that are not properly housed, the reason that people don't get enough health care, the reason that people don't have enough education in many parts of the world, even in Africa. I have a few friends over there, and one or two I've been subsidizing to go to school with children. And all of the bad things that are happening when A, there isn't enough money, and B, what there is, they're spending on armaments. And so much of the money in the world, the money that is created, is going into machines to kill people. And maybe we'll come back later to the military-industrial complex, because it has a long reputation in cooperation with intelligence agencies of deliberately starting wars that shouldn't be started, in order to provide grist for the mill in their industry. In other words, to make money for them. And to say that this is a crime, I think, is an understatement. But this has been going on for a long time. And it goes right back to the days when General Eisenhower warned us that we should beware of the military-industrial complex. And if he had really come clean on everything, he would have told us about the ET file and the fact that it had fallen into the wrong hands, because that is what he was really talking about when he warned us about the military-industrial complex. Here you had the banking industry and the arms industry all linked up, because they're all part of what I refer to throughout the book as the cabal. And they decided this was a tremendous way to make money, was to have an enemy. And so, as we've said before, Carol Rosen was working with Dr. Werner von Braun, the famous German scientist, and who mellowed in the latter part of his life and said that this military-industrial complex would have to have an enemy. And he said first it would be the communists, and then it would be the terrorists, and then it would be the ETs. And this whole thing is playing out now just exactly as he said it was. And of course, every time they start another war, whether it's, as I sort of hinted, I don't know whether the Korean War was induced, although I have some doubts based on recent evidence. But just about every war since Second World War has been induced by the interference of intelligence agencies who have been provocateurs, who have done things to make it possible to start a war. And this has certainly been true of the last 10 years, when we've had all of these wars in the Middle East that were planned for just about every possible reason except any good reason. They're all planned to be part of a movement towards world domination, and to, in the meantime, to spend so much money on armaments that, of course, the banks make fantastic amounts of money, because governments have to keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing to pay for all of these military things. And one of the big problems you have in the United States, of course, is just about every year is an argument over increasing the debt limit, because you have to keep, under this present system, keep borrowing more and more money. Well, to go back to the beginning now, or not the beginning, but say I start usually with the formation of the Bank of England 300 years ago, roughly. Another leader at the time was waging war. This is King William of Orange. Was waging war against the French, and wasn't doing too well on the continent. And he needed more armaments, needed to fix up his navy and so on, so he had to borrow money. His credit was no good. So someone came up with the idea of starting a bank. And he got Parliament to authorize the charter for the Bank of England and give it special privileges. And the rich people put in £1,200,000 in gold and lent it all to the king at 8%, which is a very high interest rate for a government-guaranteed loan, plus some little, charges along the way in addition. But then, to show his gratitude, he said, you can print £1,200,000 and lend it to your rich neighbors. So what happened was the bank was allowed to lend the same money twice, once to the government and once to private individuals, and collect interest from both. So we call that the leverage, and lend the same money twice and get interest from both parties. Well, then over the years, the leverage has gotten much greater. In the early years of the 20th century in the U.S., federally chartered banks had to have a 25% gold backing for their deposits, which meant that they were able to lend the same money 4 times. In Canada, I remember it well, we had to have 8% cash reserves, so our people were allowed to lend the same money 12.5 times. Well, then in the 1970s, when Milton Friedman came along, and with his sort of unregulated or deregulated banks, let the banks do whatever they want kind of system, that leverage went up to 20. Well, there were exceptions. One company I remember went up to 100. But the main banks were allowed to lend the same money 20 times to 20 different people and collect interest from each one. Now, this is grand larceny. But what it means is that this money they create is not real money. It's just credit, their credit that they lend. And it has to be repaid with real money, in effect, what I call blood, sweat, and tears money, and with interest. So what this does, of course, as you can see, is to allow a few people in the world to accumulate fortunes so big that you can hardly measure them. They're just absolutely phenomenal. While everybody else is in debt because they had to borrow the money to do the things they do, whether it's going to university or whatever, and pay it back. And they spend half their lives paying it off and paying the interest on it. So we are kind of debt slaves to a system where now the money creation function is a monopoly of a few private individuals, a few of the richest, most ruthless, and most uncaring people in the whole world have a monopoly over our system of money creation, and they can determine the fate of nations. They can decide if somebody in a country they don't like, a leader they want to upset or whatever, they can create enough trouble to change the leader, to bring the nation to its knees. And this is totally immoral. It is so bad I can't even describe it. And so the number one recommendation in my book is that governments have got to start creating some of the money because the people own the patents. And they should never have given the right to create money exclusively to private individuals. It was a terrible mistake. Terrible mistake 101 years ago when Congress of the United States gave your right to create your own money to a handful of the richest, most powerful, ruthless people in the whole world. And unfortunately, that still exists today. 101 years later, you haven't done anything about it, and these people have reaped vast fortunes and invested it offshore, and heaven only knows where it is. But they are, in effect, at the top of the apex in the cartel that I keep talking about, and in the cabal, and in effect, basically running the world. So we have to fix the money system, and it means that governments everywhere in the world have to start creating some of the money that goes into circulation every year. And in my book, I recommend 34%. It's a figure that I worked out that would allow governments at all levels, state, federal, and municipal, to balance their budgets with lower tax rates than presently exist. It would put a cap on the debt, so the debt would never go up again. In fact, over a period of 7 years, while the new system was being implemented, the existing debt could be reduced by somewhere between 25 and 35%, and there would be no more business cycles. We would stop having depressions and recessions, and people never knowing from one day to the next when they were going to be out of work or lose their house or lose their business because of a business cycle that they hadn't expected to come along, which we've seen so many of. So this is one of the most important recommendations in the book, and the question is to try and get enough people to take enough time to understand how we are being ripped off wholesale in the most disgusting way, really, and do something about it. And then, once we solve that problem, then we can start working on all of the other problems that I mentioned and a lot more, and start building the kind of world that we would like to see.
We're going to be hitting break soon, so right when we come back, I want to start talking about global warming and, of course, other issues such as the hidden technology. But I want to make a couple comments. You're absolutely right. The elasticity the economics that they're using of just debt is doing nothing but harm for us. And with regards to wars, I've never understood how a war can help an economy until I asked an economics professor, and they said, easy. Yeah, start a war, it'll fix your economy because you're going to be paying for all the munitions to bomb the country. Then you're going to rebuild it, not to mention all the contracts that go through with their shoelaces to their toothpaste to their clothing. Everything has a contract with a price tag on it that the taxpayers are paying. And another thing about the rich billionaires that I never understood is, what can't you buy with 50 billion that you need 60 billion? And we'll come right back and we'll talk about that, global warming, and so much more on this very special edition of
eventually the planet will start to cool off again and so on. Well, I have news for them. The science is absolutely clear. And I've mentioned quite a bit of it in my book, enough to convince me, and I think to convince most people. And, one of the books I sometimes mention is The Storms of My Grandchildren by Dr. Hansen, was one of the best experts that I have read. And it's a little heavy reading, but if you really want to go into the subject, in a minute way, get a copy of the book. But I think the title is interesting because we're already getting those storms. They're starting to come. They're huge storms in many parts of the world, unlike we've ever seen. In my own town of Toronto, a couple of years ago in the summer, streetcar had 4 feet of water around it. Never seen anything like that my whole life, and I've been around for quite a while. Don keeps talking about my golden years. If you'll forgive me, Don, I think they should be my diamond years. Just 1 degree away from gold. But the situation is getting desperate. And in my book, I list some headlines, one after another, of new projects for drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, the Beaufort Sea, the Atlantic coast, and fracking starting everywhere, and more expansion of the oil sands in Alberta. All of these things going on under the eyes of the politicians, and usually with the help, the collusion of the politicians, and it just sounds from the headlines as if nothing is happening. They're talking about, building plants and drilling and putting in pipelines with a life expectancy of 30 or 40 or 50 years, and that's not good enough. I say in the book, our house is on fire, and we have to do something about it, and we have to do something about it very, very fast. Green light at the end of the tunnel. 4 years ago, I said we had about 10 years to turn the situation around and stop the trend. When I wrote The Money Mafia and published it last fall, I said they've got 7 years. And I think that's about what we've got if we want to put the fire out. So if we're serious about saving our house for future generations, we've got to do something like change it from fossil fuel economy to clean energy economy in 7 years. Now, 2 things you need. Well, you need 3 things, I guess. First of all, you need the political will, which we haven't got. So that's something we've got to get. Secondly, you need the technology. And this cabal that I keep referring to, the military-industrial complex, it's all part of the same thing. It goes from the money cartel, which is at the apex of the cabal, and then the oil cartel, and then the transnational corporations, which are controlled by the money cartel in most cases, and then the intelligence agencies that have got on board, the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA, and a big slice of the U.S. military, all working together as part of what they call and what we have to understand as the New World Order, which is a move towards this world government, which is not elected, which is, well, call it what it is. I guess it's a kind of fascist government that is planned for us. And they're all together in this. And they control the technology that we need to save the planet. And now, one of the reasons, of course, that they don't want to do anything is because the oil cartel owns trillions of dollars worth of assets in hydrocarbons, and they want to cash them all in before coming clean on the exotic fuels. But isn't that pretty bad when you're willing to let the planet go up in flames in order to make a few more dollars that you don't need?
Paul, hi, this is John in London, and good evening to you. I wanted to ask you about, because, it's like, are we saying that the cabal is orchestrating, a green idea, a global warming? I understand myself that, a green bank or a carbon tax-based bank is based on a Rockefeller Rothschild idea. And what it will do is enslave the public to pay for carbon tax rather than for fat cat corporations and big oil and gas burners. It will be put to the public people. So, my question back to you is, do you agree that we should have a carbon tax that's possibly based on a Rothschild idea or not? What's your stance on this?
These things are symptom treating. They're not solving the problem. The problem is burning fossil fuels, and that's what we've got to stop doing. So here, you can treat symptoms. You can scratch something off your back and find out it's melanoma. But if it's a real disease, you've got to take it out. And in this case, the disease is burning fossil fuels and putting too much carbon dioxide in the air. And sure, there are things we can do, like stop cutting trees and plant more trees. But that is a subsidiary approach, and the essential approach, and in my book I'm saying we should do this in 7 years, the essential approach is to replace the fuel supply in every car, truck, tractor, boat, and house, and airplane in the world in 7 years. Now people just sort of say, hey, you've got to be kidding. I say, no, I'm not kidding. This is what has to be done. And I know it can be done because I was around during World War II, and I know that all of a sudden, all of the factories that have been making cars and refrigerators and stoves were converted to making munitions. And it was all out, it was fast, it didn't take long, and we won the war. We can do exactly the same thing in reverse. We can take all the munitions factories that are making the bombs that we shouldn't be dropping on other people, making the drones that we shouldn't be using on other people, and making the vehicles that, for heaven knows what, as contingencies that we don't need because we don't really have enemies. We just manufacture them. Take all of those factories and convert them into factories to build the little boxes of clean energy, zero-point energy, for which the technology exists, and then make the technology available on a worldwide basis without, charging a big royalty on it or anything of that kind. And in my opinion, and I say this with deference, but I have some reason to, the United States owes the people of the world, for what they've done to us in the last 10 years. The United States owes the people of the world this technology on a worldwide basis, so that people everywhere in every country can start making these boxes and providing the fuel they need to keep warm and for cooking and so on, without having to cut down trees, and to stop the emission of carbon dioxide really, really fast before it is too late. Now, this is what we've got to do, and so you need the will, the technology that we have that is available. It may take a presidential decree to get it out. And the third thing, of course, is the money for subsidizing it. And if we change the monetary system the way that we were talking about and adopt the solution that I have recommended in the book, then we'll have all of the three components necessary to save the planet for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Mr. Hellyer, we're going to take our first caller, and which in about 10 minutes we come to our break. I'm going to announce the number for everybody out there listening if you'd like to speak to the Honorable Mr. Hellyer. I just want to make a couple comments on what you just said. Weaponized drones, I think, are the scariest right now because you have all these video games that children are playing that are showing them to glorify violence. But when you, rather than fighting in a fighter jet and you see your target, even though you're from yay high dropping bombs, the difference now is you have an 18-year-old kid just out of high school sitting in this little bunker on Nellis Air Force Range or Norton Airfield, anywhere here in the U.S. that's piloting essentially the equivalent of a video game, the same equipment of a drone that's flying over Syria dropping bombs. So the disconnect between what they're actually doing and what's actually happening on the ground is further and further versus what would have happened 500 years ago when people really saw upfront battle. And I think by doing so, it makes it for the warmongers to make the soldiers have less PTSD and yet cause more damage. So I definitely worry about that. And like you said, we should turn our munitions factories into something good, the opposite of what we did during World War II. And we all have those capabilities. And one final thing I got to say is that you said all these manufactured enemies here. I worry about that because fear really controls. With that being said, let's bring on our first caller, Mr. Tom Schaefer. Tom, welcome to the show.
Gentlemen, I have a question for you, Mr. Hellyer. I'm so glad that you've done what you've done, and that is to take your reputation and say, you know what, I've got to do the right thing. And so there's a lot of us out there that are really appreciative of everything you've done. There's a controversial area. You mentioned earlier, we were talking about global warming, controversial area that some people have really glommed onto, and yet there's very little evidence. How do you feel about these trails in the sky, what people call chemtrails, and some people dismiss as merely contrails or fuel additives causing issues in the sky? And then you have this whole thing about militarization of the weather. How do you feel about these things? What is your take on those areas?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I'm looking for the answer. We've been working on full disclosure of everything that's happened in the military-industrial field in the United States in the last 60 years, and so far have gotten nothing. But who authorized chemtrails? Who gave the order to go ahead? What were the parameters of what they were trying to achieve? If this is a weather weapon, who do they plan to use the weapon against? Everybody, including the United States, or against whom? So your question is a marvelous question, and I personally worry very, very much about chemtrails and also about the HARP installations, which can do frightful things. And again, why are they there? Who are they going to be used against? What do they have in store for us next? And this is just one more reason why we have got to get a full disclosure of everything that is going on. And just before we leave this, I have in front of me here a piece of paper talking about one of the first pieces of news to come out of the world of exopolitics in 2015 was from the Central Intelligence Agency, where they say that 50% of the sightings in the 50s and 60s were U.S. planes. And they cite the U-2s the spy plane as being one of the things that people confused with UFOs. So the misinformation and disinformation is still continuing. And so bad enough not to tell the truth, but worse when you start telling untruths, so that people who are telling the truth have more trouble debunking what you're saying. And I just am glad you asked that question, because I'm worried every time I see a chemtrail. I'm worried every time I look at a HARP installation and think about where the intelligence is coming from that is guiding that, and what they have in mind for us, and what dreadful things they intend to do with weather patterns and maybe causing earthquakes and so on that they pretend are natural. And so we have to demand that the people of the United States and of the world be told what has been going on since 1945 or 6 or 7, and that they come clean. And someone was saying, just a day ago or so ago, that the problem, of course, is that everyone is under oath, and with the state of emergency and the National Security Act, the Constitution of the United States is virtually set aside. It's virtually inoperative. And everybody working in these areas has taken an oath of secrecy, and if they start telling the truth, they're going to wind up behind bars. So it has to be a public decision to demand full disclosure. And in both of my books, Light at the End of the Tunnel and the latest one, I have recommended, and it wasn't original with me, it came to me from Jim Sparks, one of the abductees who has spent more time with the extraterrestrials than just about anybody, of an amnesty being granted under the National Security Act, so that people can tell the truth without incriminating themselves and winding up behind bars for the rest of their lives. So somehow we've got to get the Congress awakened and the people awakened, and saying, we've had enough lies. You've been lying to us for 60 years, and we have had enough, and enough is enough. And you lied to us about all of these things, and you lied to us about 9/11. And we want the truth, and we want it right away, and we can't get it all in one bundle because it's too big a bundle, but we can start and ration it out over a year or two at a rate which people can absorb and understand, and then we'll have a better idea of where we're going and what all has to be done to change the course of history before it's too late.
We're going to hit our break in a couple minutes, but you've said some very remarkable things and asked probably the most important question of who. Who gave them permission? Who gave them the authority to tell us what we can and cannot know? Who gave them the authority to essentially play God, which is what they're doing when they're messing with the earth with regards to weather and earthquakes? And for them to have put themselves in that power is the very scary part. And there's actually a few billionaires, including Oprah Winfrey, that have started a group. I think it's called the Good Guys Club, something along the lines of that, where they label it. Good is in the name. And it's a group based in New York City with other billionaires that essentially is looking for a way to depopulate the planet. I think that these people have this sort of authority is very sick. Now, going back to what you said, Jim Sparks, he got that idea actually from the extraterrestrials, and I think it's a brilliant one. If we don't grant those people amnesty to come forward with what they've learned over all their years, whether it be in military or intelligence, then they're going to face prosecution and possibly execution. There are several people that have died. There's actually a great new book written by Nick Redfern called Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, where at first glance, I thought it was people that have died from extraterrestrials, but there's a portion of that from pathogens, but specifically he deals with people that have been killed who wanted to talk. And one of them being the first one, first MJ1, Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. So that brings us to our break, and that's going to lead us into our very important topic of disclosure. Everybody stay tuned and join us back for Hour 2 with the Honorable Paul Hellyer. Well as the entire world. And of course, his latest book, The Money Mafia, with the subtitle A World in Crisis, couldn't be further from the truth. I know several of you have wanted to ask questions, so this hour we will be taking questions. If you're calling from the East Coast, you can call the general station number, which is area code 347-688-2902, 347-688-2902, or 818-923-1713, 818-923-1713. Mr. Hellyer, we already have our first two callers that actually called in a break. The first one I could see here is Fausto Perez. Fausto, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dr. J, thanks for letting me call in. First, I want to say thanks to the former Minister of Defense for touching on all these really important issues, like the monopoly we have with the money cartel and global warming. The question I had was, I work with this group called LA UFO Channel. We set up events where we show people UFOs and we record them in front of dozens of witnesses and get all this scientific information we can off of them, like the size of the ships, how fast they can fly, and then recording them with the best equipment we got. What would we have to do with these events in our studies in order to get them recognized by the government?
Well, I have no idea what the answer to that question is because, as you know, I was part of a citizens hearing group that appeared in Washington a couple of years ago, and we had 6 people on the panel there who were all former Congress persons and one former senator, and not one of them really knew what was going on, even though they had been part of the Congress for years and helping to fund these things that have been happening for this period of time. So trying to find outlets is extremely difficult, and I congratulate you and all the people involved in the station for what they're doing, and other people are doing the same kind of thing. But getting real information into the mainstream media is almost impossible because so much of it is controlled by the cabal. And there's a book called The Web of Debt by Ellen Brown from Los Angeles, who was one of the world's top people in the money subject. And she said that after the Fed was established 101 years ago, that the Morgan Bank went out and bought control of the 25 most important papers in the United States so that they could, in effect, censor what went in about the subject that we're talking about. And so this, I'm sure, is a situation today that there is censorship on all of the major issues that we're talking about tonight, especially money and the ET technology and presence, and who's controlling what, and why we have to be fearful of the New World Order people. So I'm looking for the answer to that question too, and if you find it before I do, I send it along.
Go ahead.
I had one idea. I'm hoping someday I get the chance to set up an event in front of the White House with all my people who help us do the research, and contact the UFOs that we do and have them come out right over the White House and record them there. I'm hoping that'll be able to get some awareness out to it.
Well, that's an idea, but I think you have to be more careful now than you would have 50 years ago, because there might be some weapons around that would make it dangerous for them to do that.
Which goes to show how primitive we are. If we're going to shoot down the visitors, why would they want to come visit us? And that's a very sad part of mankind. We have our second caller, who I know you do know, Mr. Hellyer, and this is the one and only, also a great friend, Jeremy Kenyon Lockyer Corbell. Mr. Corbell, it's a pleasure to have you on. You have a question for Mr. Hellyer?
Yeah, actually, I have 4 questions for Mr. Hellyer. I'm really excited. Thanks for having me on, Dr. J. Mr. Hellyer, this is Jeremy Corbell. I'm an investigative filmmaker. I'm involved with the Citizen Hearing on Disclosure. We spent a little time on the bus together riding to the location. I was basically going around doing personal interviews with some of the witnesses. I want to thank you, first of all, for speaking out on that day. That was a huge moment. I do have 4 questions for you tonight that I hope will bring to light some of your understanding of this situation. First of all, you made statements at the citizen hearing to the effect that you believe in open and transparent government, and that the true currency of the 21st century will be trust, and that the only way to regain that trust is to find and tell the truth. And these are very powerful statements. Like your friend Edgar Mitchell expressed, we are not alone in the universe. And you also said that, in fact, you are the first person of cabinet rank in the G8 group of countries to admit to the UFO presence unequivocally. And my first question to you with this history that we've just talked about is, you stated that in 2005, by reading a book, your eyes were open to the UFO reality. You testified at the citizen hearing that you confirmed the content of that book with the United States Air Force general. Can you describe to us that experience of confirming some of what was in that book?
Yeah, I can. As I indicated earlier, I had no intention of going public until I had come to that conclusion. But I was reading this book, which had been sent to me a couple of years before by Pierre Junot, a young bilingual Canadian from Ottawa. And at the time, I didn't have either the interest or the time to read the stuff he was sending me, but he sent me this book, and I put it away, and then for my holidays the following year couldn't find it, and then the next year I was looking for something and couldn't find it, and the day after Roswell popped up. And I took it to the lake with me for my summer reading. My late wife and I operated a little tourist resort north of Toronto for 45 years, and so that's where we would go. And I went up there, and I was about halfway through the book, and I started saying to myself, is this fiction or fact? Because the year before, when I'd been looking for the day after Roswell, I couldn't find it, and so I read The Life of Pi, and I found it fascinating. And it wasn't until I got very near the end that I concluded that it was in fact fiction. So I said, it has to be fact, because I recognize the names of the generals and the airfields that are mentioned in the book. And it just can't be totally manufactured. So when I was about halfway through, my nephew came along and said, what are you reading? I told him, and he said, well, I'm a skeptic. And I said, well, that's okay. You're entitled to be a skeptic. And he went home, and a couple of days later he phoned and said, that book you're reading, I mentioned it to the general, and he said, every word is true and more. And this was somebody that he had met at an air exhibition, a retired general.
Do you know which general it was?
Oh, I do, yes, but I'm not at liberty to say. And,
okay.
Because for obvious reasons. And,
right, it's a sensitive subject.
Are you able to disclose the book, Paul?
Pardon me?
Are you able to disclose the book that was the initial book that you read?
Oh, that was, the day after Roswell.
By Colonel Philip Corso.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso.
So you answered that first question. I was always curious if you could disclose who that general was, and I would encourage that if in any way you could talk with that general and see if he'd come forward, being who you are, that would be a huge service to this whole question, this problem we have of the UFO reality.
I don't know whether it would or not, but the problem is how much they're allowed to say. And,
right.
So anyway, I got his number and phoned him, and even before I could say hello and how are you and what's the weather, he said every word is true and more. And he spent the next 20 minutes telling me about the more with the limit of what he thought he could say. And
so he specifically told you directly that everything in the book was real and more when you personally had a phone call with him?
Oh yeah, I called him and talked to him for 20 minutes, and he said every word was true and more. And then he told me about the fact that there had been direct meetings between the United States officials and extraterrestrials. And
so he was a general in the army, and this is a man who would have had the position to be in the position to know.
Well, he was a former United States Air Force general, so he was, yes, indeed. So I trusted his judgment, and on that basis decided to accept the invitation that was outstanding and to go public, because by the time I finished the book, I was convinced that the issues are huge. We're talking about a cosmos here that's teeming with life, both animate and inanimate, and the more we know about it, the better. And it's just not right, and maybe not in our best interests in any way, to pretend that it doesn't exist and to try and shut it out. So
absolutely. So I have I appreciate that so much. And I have 4 questions. That was the first. My second question is: are you familiar with the Robert Bob Lazar story, and can you comment on it?
I'm familiar with it, and prefer not to comment on it, but it sounded pretty good to me.
Are you aware that Lazar is speaking out again in February, on the 21st, in Arizona, at the 2015 UFO Congress?
No, I didn't know that, but more power to him.
Okay. We would love to have you there, of course, if you were interested. It's going to be amazing that he'll be speaking out again after 25 years, and George Knapp arranged that for the Congress, which is really a special opportunity. So, third question.
That's good news.
Yeah? Okay, good. I'm glad you think it's good news, too. So, third question, and this is specifically about, you and your motivation in life. As one of the services, as Minister of National Defense of Canada, you spent a great deal of effort to unite the Army, Navy, and Air Force into a single Canadian Defense Force. You're a man of great experience and ability to unify complex systems. And in the spirit of truth and unification, what specific steps are you willing to take to help get the unprecedented testimony from the citizen hearing?
To which? And so you asked me what steps I was willing to take, but I didn't hear what I was supposed to do.
Yeah. What specific steps are you willing to take to help get the unprecedented testimony from the citizen hearing into the hands of policymakers and persons of significant influence to help illuminate the UFO reality? What can you personally do?
Well, I've done it. I've spent the last year and a half writing a book about what I was talking about in Washington.
I can't wait to read it.
Well, you'll find it interesting, I think, thought-provoking. I don't know I'm pretty sure you won't be disappointed, because it's up to date, and it does cover most of the major issues in the world at the present time, and offers a long list of things that have to be done. And one of them, I'll just mention one, that somebody has got to take the lead in what I call a moral and spiritual revolution, which would include full disclosure. And the person best suited and best situated, I guess, to do that is President Obama. Love him or hate him, he's in a job where he can do, which no one else can do, and that is to get some things happening that are just the opposite to everything that's been happening for years and decades, but especially since 2011. And if he would do that, he could still emerge not just as another president, but as a great president. And what I'm saying is that there should be a new oath, not only to the United States, allegiance to the United States of America and its Constitution, but also a subsidiary to renounce the idea of a new world order with an unelected totalitarian government. And starting with the president, go right down the list through the cabinet and the chiefs of staff and right on down for everybody that's serving in the public service in the United States. And if people are willing to, that they can't take the oath of renouncing the New World Order, let them retire in peace. But if they can, to leave them there, and on the understanding that if they're found out to be lying, that their still allegiance is still to the New World Order, that the penalty would be very great and would involve several years in jail, maybe a considerable time in jail. And this way, you would weed out the people who are planning to take away the freedom of the people of the United States, have been working at it desperately for the last 10 years, and who want to be in a position to impose martial law and to extend it to other parts of the world, even if it means by means of force. And I think the thing that worries me more than anything else, and worries certainly the ETs at the same time, is the fact that they have not renounced the possibility of using atomic weapons. And only psychopaths would even think of using atomic weapons. They just should not be contemplated, and to even consider using first strike atomic weapons is so far from anything that should be tolerated under any circumstances that it's almost incomprehensible. But this is the situation you've got at the moment, and this is the situation that has to be brought under control before it's too late, because time is moving swiftly, and they've just started, the industrial military complex has just started one more war in Iraq in order to keep their military machine going and to keep the money flowing in and to keep the debt from going up. And so where's it going to stop if somebody doesn't renounce the whole idea of a single world government with no accountability and no transparency, and start coming clean and having the kind of world that we're capable of now, because we have all of the resources and all of the know-how necessary to build a wonderful world of justice for everybody. And we're not doing it. We're going in the opposite direction. We're going in the same direction in the last 6,000 years of one empire after another. They just keep building themselves up, being dictatorial empires, and then eventually they disappear into the history books. But the amount of hardship that they inflict in the process is not acceptable, and certainly we should be well past that in our development as a species. And if we don't get past that, why, heaven help us.
Jeremy, just want to let you know we've got a couple minutes till break, but go ahead, ask your question, and the other callers stay on. Go ahead.
My last question is just one fourth question. I'll take my question off air, actually. I hope to speak with you in the future as I'm investigating a lot of these things and things are coming up I'd love to talk with you about. But here's the deal, is first of all, I want to thank you for your honor and your courage, Mr. Hellyer, for coming forward. Your words do not fall on deaf ears. They make a huge impact in these investigations. The last question that I have is Senator Gravel at the citizen hearing, who was vocally he had less faith in representative government than you seem to. You seem to be an optimist. He asked you at the citizen hearing on disclosure what your solution was for the UFO truth embargo problem. And I'd like to just ask you this question again. What steps can we take as citizens to reestablish trust with our government and discover the true nature of the UFO reality? What can we do?
Well, I think if you could institute this new oath of allegiance that I was talking about, that you could weed out the sheep from the goats, as the saying goes, or the wheat from the chaff, but you have to somehow at the same time tell the members of Congress in the most blunt terms that they have been duped for decades. They have paid trillions of dollars for weapons of war that they don't even know about. And they have really defaulted on their responsibility to people, because the first thing that elected representatives are supposed to be is responsible for the money that they collect as taxes and the way it is spent. But they haven't been doing that. So I think the American elector have got to make it very clear to the members of Congress from the major parties, because these are not partisan issues that we're talking about. These are life and death issues, and everybody should be held accountable, and we should make it clear to the congressmen that they have to act and act firmly.
And that brings us to our final break. Everybody stay tuned. More from the Honorable Paul Hellyer when we return.
Radio at Freedom Radio. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the host.
So you could hear direct live streams. Go to Dr. J Radio Live, as well as seeing upcoming guests. And soon you'll be able to hear all the past shows, including the other interviews we've done with the Honorable Mr. Hellyer. With that being said, let's take a caller who's been on hold for quite some time, someone who you also should know, as well as for the other caller, absolutely knows, and that is filmmaker Ruben Langdon. Mr. Langdon, welcome to the show.
Hi, guys. Hi, Mr. Hellyer. It's been a while since the hearings. Good to see you.
It is a while since the hearings. Seems like ages ago.
Yeah. So I kind of chimed in a little late and caught the last half of the show, but I've been listening to many of your other interviews on other networks and coast to coast, and just solid information as always, and I love your approach on not just the ET issue, but as you said, it's a global issue, the getting the truth out and kind of living by new standards, and that's kind of what's needed, I think, and the ET issue is for me a doorway into all of that world, and I think everybody's doing their part, and really appreciate everything you've been contributing. I did have one question in regard to during the hearings. I didn't get a chance to ask you during the hearings or right after, because there was so much commotion going on. But you, on the last day, at the closing ceremonies, closing testimonies, you were reading from a book, and kind of taking some quotes, and specifically one of the quotes you had taken later on YouTube had gone viral. This 10-minute clip, people were taking it, and you had mentioned that there were a number of alien races here, and I forgot to ask, what was the name of the book? And I guess that's the first question, and I'll follow up with the second question after that.
The book I was reading from was The Light at the End of the Tunnel.
Oh, okay.
The previous one.
And who was that by?
Him.
By me.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, by yourself. Okay, so I'm sorry. So then, how did you come across that information? I think you had mentioned it during the hearings, and then has any? I guess, yeah. How did you come across that information, if I might ask?
Yeah, you're talking about the different species.
The different species, because I've researched and heard numerous species as well, but you were pretty specific in the number of species, at least. I think I just mentioned the 5 or 6 that I had listed in the book. Okay, I see.
Because I think the chairman that day, who was the last person to be convinced, had sort of said, "Well, who are they and where do they come from?" Those are the only 2 questions that my colleagues hadn't answered specifically. And so at the beginning of what I was talking about, I said, well, I'll deal with those first. And I gave a list of I think 5 or 6 species, and then 3 or 4 different star systems that they come from.
Would you like to talk about those real quick?
No, not really,
okay.
Because it takes a lot of time. And my memory isn't as good as it used to be. One, I will mention one though that I didn't mention that night. One that's just come across, and that's the Arcturians. I'd never heard of them, and somebody came up to me just recently and asked me what I knew about them, and I said nothing. And so I looked them up, and they're fascinating. Because it's a 5th-dimensional civilization that is allegedly a prototype of Earth's future, and they have had an influence on us in the past, and they're planning something that they may be doing on Earth that would be quite dramatic sometime in the future, and so anybody can just go to the internet and look them up and read about them, and I think we'll be given hope, because here's a species that is very much interested in our future, and whether they will intervene on our behalf or not, I don't know, because there are other species that are interested in our future and our welfare, and allegedly they only come to our rescue if they're invited, and they haven't been invited. So if anybody's looking for something that you're not familiar with, well, just go to the internet and punch in our Arcturus, and that's Arcturus, and you'll get something that's quite fascinating reading, and at the same time more than a little bit hopeful, both for Earth and for perhaps the future of the human species sometime in the distant future.
Some of those abduction specialists that we've interviewed speak about the Arcturians as being very loving beings that truly care for our welfare and the fact that we're destroying our planet. So I just wanted to throw that in there, because I've never heard of up until the last year, and now more and more people are talking about. Ruben, do you have any more follow-up questions?
Yes, I guess then, Mr. Hellyer, for the information, just listen to your book, and you answered I guess what was my next question was, how did you obtain the information about, for example, the Arcturians? On the other races, how did you go about obtaining that information? Was that also discussed during your conversation with this general?
No, that's been accumulated over the years from reading, 25 books and interviewing people who have been abducted and all sorts of people. A lot of research.
I see. Great. And I guess do we have time for another question?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. And then my question, and this has probably been asked a million times, but have you had any personal experiences with extraterrestrial dimensional type scenarios, whether it's sightings or actual interaction? I wouldn't say abductions, but what do they call the other experiencers? I guess is the new term.
If you're talking about experience with the beings, the extraterrestrial beings, the answer is no. I have seen one of their ships perform in the skies over my place in Muskoka. Very fascinating. And I won't go into the whole long story as to how this came about. A couple of years ago at our Canadian Thanksgiving, when my wife went out to stargaze, and she looked in one direction, so there was a star in the west, and I turned around and said, "Yeah, there's a brighter one in the east." And all of a sudden, she looked too, and we knew almost instinctively that it was not a star. But we watched transfixed for about 20 minutes until our necks were almost broken from watching. And this machine would change position in the sky by 3 or 4 degrees in as many seconds. And it was absolutely fascinating. And of course, I went through all the usual checks, satellites, space station, all this sort of stuff. Checked everything out. There was just nothing that it could possibly be except a spaceship. And it was not unusual for sighting in that area, because actually in the right at the end of the tunnel, there's a picture of a UFO that was taken from the dock of our place in Muskoka. And earlier on, some years earlier, there had been about 10, I guess, of our guests who had seen a UFO across the bay one night when they were having a party. And in the morning, they were telling us all about it. And some of us were a little bit, inquisitive about how much Jack Daniels they'd had before they saw it. And some of them had a fair amount. But there were 3 or 4 of the 10 or a dozen people who had seen it who had had nothing to drink at all. And they all had the same story. So we had to accept the fact that it was real, and I put it in a little book called a little bit of history of Muskoka, a little bit of Muskoka, very 100-page book that did not get wide circulation, but some people said it was my best book.
I have a question about that, Mr. Hellyer. This is Jeremy again. Would you say that through your experience as acting Defense Minister of Canada, that you were abreast of and were familiar with the technologies that your nation and other nations of the world have and their capabilities?
Oh, if you're talking about the ETs, no, absolutely not, because that civil servants, and I think this is true in your country too, they don't tell the politicians what's going on. We've been discussing half the evening how little Congress know, and they're not in the loop. They're out of it as far as really knowing what's going on is concerned. And and that was true.
So if you don't have a need to know about the technologies and defense of the nation that you're generally in control of, though, they're not going to tell you the specifics of those defense.
That's true of the United States and the presidents, because what they're told is very limited. And all I really knew in those days was that there were sightings, and they would give me the sightings reports and tell me which ones they thought were, sightings of a planet or some natural cause. And I can't remember the exact percentage, but I discussing this with Mick Pope when I met him not long after I went public. I think that the experience in Canada was very close to what they had in the United Kingdom. About 80% were natural phenomena, and something like 15 or 20% were actually unknown.
Mr. Hellyer, we are down to 10 minutes. I just want to make a couple comments, and then I want to geared towards something important. First of all, our governments have done a great job in ridiculing people and demonizing the subject by making them sound bad, just like Werner von Braun told Miss Rosen. There's a famous quote, I'm sure you know this: what the eye see and the ears hear, the mind perceives. So if the government is telling us something and repeatedly via propaganda or other ways, then obviously the attitudes of people are easily controlled that way. And the other comment I want to make is about the human-looking extraterrestrials. If you speak to Paula Harris, she'll say that they're here to help us to integrate in our society, where if you speak to other people such as Dr. David Jacobs, he thinks that they're here to infiltrate us. So there's obviously two camps, but I wanted to focus on the positive contacts, because there is positive out there. There are positive white hats within our community. Hopefully, we would like to hope that they're positive politicians that really would like to help us instead of further their own pockets. And you are someone that can lead by example. You are one of those politicians who is a man of your word, very honest, and as I mentioned earlier, very credible, unimpeachable, and someone who has not been corrupted by politics, who is continuing to serve our world. And that is why I hold you at the utmost honorable level you can. But let's speak about the positiveness and the positive contacts.
I think there are a lot of positive things going on. And I have two sort of principles. One, I've never written a book talking about the problems without posing solutions. I don't think it's fair to, say everything's going to where, and then wind up by saying there's nothing we can do about it, or just leave it hanging. So in all of my books, I have, without exception, the ones that are on subjects like this, put in what I thought were possible solutions. And in this latest book, I've not only done that, but I said at the end, the postscript, the missing link in all of these terrible things that are going on in the world is spirituality. That's the missing link. Because what the cabal is doing, thinking of letting the world go up in flames just to collect more money from oil deposits, that's immoral. It's immoral, to use the correct word. And there's no spiritual element there except lack of it, just a total void, a spiritual void. And the same way with tremendous amounts of money that have been spent. And then the question of the great deception of 9/11, when high-up officials in the United States knew in advance that there was going to be a strike and did nothing to stop it. Let it happen. And then used that as an excuse to change the world, to impose a state of emergency and invoke NATO in a way that was never intended to be, and so on. But on the other side, you have now people saying there is a better way, and we can start doing things. And so there's little groups doing positive things all over the world, helping people, providing shelters for people who are homeless, providing health care for people who have none, providing food for people who are without food, providing education for people without education, and providing inspiration for people who just think there's nothing to life but self-satisfaction, instant gratification. So there's many things happening on the positive side, and I get a tremendous amount of mail, more than I can cope with, and I have to apologize if any of you have ever written me and haven't got a reply or didn't get it as soon as you thought you should have. It's simply because I can't cope with all of the mail that comes in and still get anything done by way of writing or reflecting. Just do my best, that's all I can. But the encouraging thing, and this has been going on for months, I'm getting from all over the world, and especially the United States, letters from people 15 years old, 17 years old, 18 years old, college students, recently graduated students, and others, and they're saying, we want a better world. We want to do something positive. Do you have any ideas for us? What can we do? Because we're not satisfied with what's going on, and we know there's something definitely wrong, and we want to do something right and to create a better world. And the volume of those letters has been increasing, and the extraordinary insight of some of them is really quite amazing. I just feel uplifted often after reading one of them and saying, boy, if we just get enough people like that, and they're the opposite to the ones that you're talking about who are playing the games about killing. These are people who say that there is something to life, and there's a reason we're here on the planet, which is not the old reason of building an empire and shooting everybody who gets in the way. It is in building an empire of love instead of an empire based on force. And those two operative words are, I think, the most powerful words in the world. The worst four-letter word in the world is hate. And when we do things like we've been doing the last 10 years, it generates hate. And that brings a negative reaction. And the more you try and kill it, you can't kill it because you can't kill an idea, an ideology. And so this whole strategy, the last 15 years, has been nothing more than putting money into the pockets of the industrial military complex and building up their empire, and the opposite of trying to have peace on Earth.
If the aliens, Paul, in league with the cabal, we think of cabal, we think of humans and men and rich fat cats, but is there an alien interaction with these beings?
Well,
with these cabal?
The best of the information I have is that they have been working together for a long time. But, again, more than one species. And one has to differentiate, maybe, between the species.
Well, I understand there's 57 or even 58 now, like a Heinz variety. How the number sticks in my mind. But then we've got a good and a bad side. We've got good aliens, I understand, and then we've got bad aliens that, they just not just abduct us, but in some cases they don't actually bring you back, And so this is another question that I find that Disclosure Project, Citizen Hearing, are they addressing this in their understandings of the big picture?
Well, I don't think they've got enough information to address the whole picture. That's the problem. And I think you're quite right that most of the species, in my opinion, and when I say my opinion, it's just based on what I've read and learned from talking to people, most of the species are benign and in our corner. There may be one or two who have other plans, and that's what we have to know about and who's working with them and whether there's any...
well, they certainly do it carte blanche.
Johnny.
And I wondered,
Johnny, we're out of time. We got a little over a minute left. We do have one final question from a listener, Mr. Hellyer, and then I want to let you finish with whatever you want to say. Basically, the question is Mr. Hellyer mentoring any current politicians on coming out? If you want to briefly address that, and then go ahead and we'll finish with final statements.
The answer is I'm mentoring a lot of people, some of them of whom are going into politics, I hope, and I'm in the process of trying to get in touch with some people who are already in politics to see if I can persuade them that there's a better way to do things. And I mentioned earlier that I was having a strategy meeting on Saturday, and this is one of the things that's on the agenda is who to get in touch with first and the ways to go about it and try and get the message through to somebody who is in a position of power. Not easy, mind you, but certainly well worth the effort. And when it comes down to the bottom line, the cabal has the money and the power, and we have the numbers. And if we could just get enough people mobilized, and that's the reason I'm spending so much time trying to get people to read the Money Mafia. If we just get enough people worked up to the point where they will do something, then we can win. And as far as I'm concerned, we have to win.